Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of the day or night these documented accounts reach. In 1960, Milford City was a place where secrets stayed buried, both figuratively and literally. Located in the southeastern corner of Alabama, this sleepy town of just over 4,000 souls sat nestled between dense pine forests and rolling farmland. The Dykes family had lived on the outskirts of town for 3 generations, their property backing up against nearly 40 acres of woodland that separated them from their closest neighbors. The family was known for keeping to themselves, but not in a way that aroused suspicion. They attended church services at the local Baptist congregation, paid their taxes on time, and Harold Dykes, the patriarch, was employed as a maintenance supervisor at the county hospital for over 25 years. What made the Dykes property unique was something few people in town knew about: a concrete bunker built into the sloping terrain behind their modest 2-story home. According to county records, the structure was constructed in 1953 during the height of Cold War tensions, when many Americans were building fallout shelters. The bunker's entrance was concealed beneath a small tool shed approximately 70 feet behind the main house. This detail would have remained an unremarkable footnote in local history had it not been for what was discovered there in the autumn of 1967. On October 8th of that year, local authorities responded to a call from Marianne Dykes, Harold's wife of 31 years. The official report, now preserved in county archives, stated she contacted the sheriff's department at approximately 6:45 in the evening, reporting that her husband had not returned home after going to check on something in the backyard nearly 5 hours earlier. When questioned further, Mrs. Dykes explained that her husband routinely inspected their property, particularly after heavy rainfall. The previous night had brought severe thunderstorms to the area, dropping nearly 4 inches of rain in less than 3 hours. Deputy Sheriff Thomas Holloway and Officer James Merritt arrived at the Dykes residence at 7:22 that evening. What they discovered would haunt them for the remainder of their careers. According to Holloway's written statement, the officers found Harold Dykes inside the bunker, unresponsive. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, but this convenient explanation would soon unravel as merely the beginning of a much darker narrative. Something was off from the moment we stepped onto that property, Holloway would later tell a local reporter in 1971. The missus was too calm, no tears, just kept saying he must have fallen. But that wasn't what bothered me most. It was the smell coming from that bunker. Not decomposition, something else. Something chemical. The Dykes family home was a white clapboard structure with green shutters, built in the 1920s by Harold's father, Augustus Dykes. The property featured a detached garage, a small vegetable garden, and a clothesline that Mrs. Dykes used religiously every Monday morning. To all outward appearances, it was the quintessential rural American household, tidy, modest, and unremarkable. Neighbors described the couple as pleasant but private. Harold was known to wave when passing in his 1958 Ford pickup, but rarely engaged in lengthy conversations. Marianne was more sociable, occasionally participating in church fundraisers or exchanging recipes with other women in the community. Their only son, Richard, had moved to Mobile after graduating high school in 1957. According to town records, he visited infrequently, typically around major holidays. When interviewed after his father's death, Richard claimed he knew about the bunker but had never been inside. Dad was particular about it, he told authorities, said it was for emergency purposes only, and he was the one responsible for maintaining it. Mom never went in there either, as far as I know. But what truly set the Dykes property apart wasn't visible from the road or even from most of the yard. The bunker's entrance was disguised as a storm cellar, with wooden doors laying at a 45-degree angle against the hillside behind the house. Once these doors were lifted, concrete steps descended approximately 12 feet below ground level. The main chamber of the bunker measured roughly 15 by 20 feet, with reinforced concrete walls nearly 8 inches thick. County building permits from 1953 indicated that Harold had hired a construction crew from Montgomery to pour the foundation and erect the structure, but dismissed them before the interior was completed, claiming he would finish it himself. For 14 years, whatever happened inside that bunker remained known only to Harold Dykes. Even after his death, the truth would emerge slowly, like groundwater seeping through cracks in concrete. The morning after Harold's body was discovered, Sheriff William Tanner arrived at the Dykes property with the county coroner, Dr. Gerald Faulkner. The purpose of their visit was to conduct a more thorough examination of both the deceased and the bunker itself. What they found contradicted the initial assessment of a simple cardiac event. The space had been modified extensively, noted Sheriff Tanner in his official report. The rear wall featured a secondary chamber that did not appear on any of the original building plans. This chamber, measuring approximately 8 by 10 feet, contained various medical equipment, the purpose of which was not immediately clear. The coroner's preliminary examination revealed that Harold Dykes had indeed suffered cardiac arrest, but there were indications that his heart failure may have been precipitated by exposure to unknown chemicals. A small puncture wound was discovered on his right forearm, consistent with an injection. Toxicology reports would later be inconclusive, as many substances were not routinely tested for in 1967, particularly in rural Alabama laboratories. The following day, county officials obtained a warrant to search the entire property. What they discovered in the Dykes home only deepened the mystery. In Harold's study, investigators found a locked filing cabinet containing medical journals, many with pages marked and annotated in Harold's handwriting. Most notable were several volumes on experimental treatments for various psychological conditions, with particular emphasis on what was then called extreme melancholia and nervous disorders. Harold had no medical training that we could establish, Sheriff Tanner wrote. His position at the hospital was strictly maintenance-related. However, the level of technical knowledge displayed in his notes suggested someone with at least some understanding of pharmacology and human physiology. When questioned about these materials, Mary Ann Dykes maintained that her husband had always been interested in medicine and often brought home discarded medical journals from the hospital. She claimed to have no knowledge of what he did with this information or why he spent so much time in the bunker. Harold was a private man, she told investigators. He had his interests, and I had mine. I didn't ask questions about his projects, and he didn't interfere with my gardening or church activities. This explanation, while plausible on the surface, would soon prove insufficient as more details emerged. The most disturbing discovery came 3 days after Harold's death, when investigators removed several floorboards in the bunker's main chamber. Beneath them, they found a metal lockbox containing several notebooks dating back to 1954. These journals, written in Harold's meticulous handwriting, documented what he referred to as sessions with unnamed subjects. The entries were clinical in tone, detailing various treatments and their effects. Subject responds favorably to increased dosage, read one entry from June 1956. Tremors subsided within 4 minutes. Memory impairment continues to be an effective side effect. Another entry, dated November 1959, stated, "Subject becoming resistant to current formula. Adjustments necessary. Increasing compound B by 15 libagurs produced desired compliance without respiratory complications noted in previous trials." Most disturbing were the entries that referenced what Harold called the holding area, which investigators came to believe was the secondary chamber discovered in the bunker. Soundproofing improvements performing as expected, he wrote in February 1960. Neighboring property developed, requiring additional precautions. Will limit sessions to evenings and weekends when ambient noise can mask any breakthrough sounds. As the investigation continued through the fall of 1967, authorities began to piece together a troubling narrative. It appeared that Harold Dykes, maintenance supervisor and seemingly ordinary family man, had been conducting unauthorized experiments in his backyard bunker for over a decade. But the identity of his subjects remained unclear, as did the purpose of his work. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. On November 21, 1967, a former hospital employee named Dorothy Winters contacted the sheriff's department after reading about the investigation in the local newspaper. Winters, who had worked as an administrative assistant in the psychiatric wing of the county hospital from 1952 to 1966, provided critical information that would reshape the entire case. There were patients who disappeared, she told Sheriff Tanner. Not many, maybe one every year or two. The official explanation was always that they had been transferred to state facilities or released to family care. But the paperwork was sometimes irregular, and Harold was often involved somehow, volunteering to transport patients or assist with late-night transfers. Winters claimed that at least 7 patients had disappeared under questionable circumstances during her tenure at the hospital. All had been diagnosed with various psychological disorders, ranging from severe depression to what was then called hysterical neurosis. All were adults without close family connections, people who might not be immediately missed. "I never said anything because I couldn't prove anything was wrong," Winters explained. "The doctors signed off on everything and Harold was well respected, but I always felt something wasn't right." The timing of these transfers was odd, always after hours, always with minimal staff present. Armed with this new information, investigators returned to the Dykes property with a more specific focus. In the secondary chamber of the bunker, they discovered something that had been overlooked during the initial searches: a small drainage system built into the concrete floor, leading to a separate septic tank not connected to the main house. This tank, when excavated, contained traces of various sedatives and other pharmaceuticals commonly used in psychiatric treatment during that era. The most damning evidence came when investigators compared the handwriting in Harold's journals with the hospital's transfer records for the patients identified by Dorothy Winters. In at least 3 cases, the signatures authorizing the transfers appeared to have been forged by the same hand that wrote the experimental notes, Harold Dykes. By December 1967, the investigation had expanded to include state authorities. The bunker was sealed off as a crime scene, and Mary Ann Dykes was placed under intense scrutiny. She maintained her ignorance of her husband's activities, a claim that investigators found increasingly difficult to believe. The noises, the smells, the comings and goings. She lived less than 100 feet from that bunker for 14 years, noted one state investigator in his report. Either she was willfully ignorant or she was complicit. Yet proving Mary Ann's involvement proved challenging. No physical evidence tied her to the bunker's interior. No fingerprints, no handwriting, no witnesses who had ever seen her enter the structure. The investigation reached a stalemate that would persist for months, with Mary Ann Dykes continuing to live in the family home, ostensibly mourning her husband, while under the watchful eye of local law enforcement. The case took an unexpected turn in April 1968, when Richard Dykes returned to Milford City to help his mother relocate to a smaller home closer to town. During the moving process, a locksmith was called to open several cabinets in Harold's study for which keys could not be located. Inside one such cabinet, authorities discovered a hidden compartment containing audio cassette recordings. These tapes, dating from 1958 to 1967, contained what appeared to be session recordings of Harold's work with his subjects. The voices captured were often distorted or slurred, presumably due to the effects of whatever substances had been administered. Most disturbing was the occasional presence of a second voice, female, measured, clinical, that several officers believed belonged to Mary Ann Dykes. "Increase the dosage," the female voice instructed on one recording dated July 1963. "He's still resisting the suggestion pattern." When confronted with these recordings, Mary Ann Dykes suffered what appeared to be a nervous breakdown. She was hospitalized for 6 weeks, during which time she neither confirmed nor denied her involvement in her husband's activities. Upon her release, she left Alabama entirely, reportedly moving to an undisclosed location in the Midwest. The case against her remained circumstantial, and no formal charges were ever filed. The full scope of Harold and possibly Mary Ann Dykes' activities may never be known. Hospital records from that era remain incomplete, and many of the officials involved in the original investigation have since passed away. What is certain is that between 1954 and 1967, at least 7 psychiatric patients disappeared from the county hospital where Harold Dykes worked, and evidence strongly suggests they met their fate in a concrete bunker behind a seemingly ordinary family home in Milford City, Alabama. The Dykes property remained abandoned for several years following the investigation. In 1972, the county seized it for unpaid taxes. The main house was eventually sold and renovated, but the bunker was filled with concrete and permanently sealed. The current owners, who purchased the property in 1978, were informed of its history but chose to build their lives there nonetheless. "It's just land," the new owner told a local reporter at the time. "What happened here was terrible, but that doesn't make the soil or the trees evil. Besides, they sealed up that bunker so thoroughly it might as well not exist anymore." But for those who worked the original case, the memory of what they discovered beneath that unassuming tool shed would never be so easily buried. Deputy Thomas Holloway never spoke publicly about the specifics of what he saw inside the Dykes bunker on that autumn evening in 1967. His official report, filed the following day, contained only the most clinical description of the scene, the position of Harold's body, the visible medical equipment, the unusual modifications to the structure. What the report didn't capture was the profound psychological impact the discovery had on the 34-year-old deputy. Tom was never the same after that call, his widow Margaret revealed in a rare interview granted to the County Historical Society in 1976. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, sweating and muttering about the chair and the marks on the walls. When I'd ask him what he meant, he'd just shake his head and say it was better if I didn't know. Holloway resigned from the Sheriff's Department in 1969, citing health concerns. He took a position as a night security guard at a warehouse in Montgomery, deliberately choosing work that would limit his interactions with others. He died of a massive stroke in 1975 at the age of 42. In the years between his resignation and death, he kept a journal that his widow discovered among his personal effects. Most entries were mundane, but scattered throughout were references to the Dykes case, cryptic notes that suggested he knew more than was ever included in official reports. "The restraints weren't just for holding them down," read one such entry from January 1972. HD designed them to measure responses, each strap connected to a gauge. He wasn't just experimenting, he was collecting data. But for what purpose, and who received his findings? This last question, the possibility that Harold Dykes wasn't working alone, haunted investigators long after the case was officially closed in 1969 due to the death of the primary suspect and insufficient evidence to prosecute Mary Ann. The modified medical equipment found in the bunker was sophisticated, often featuring customized components that would have been difficult for Harold to design or acquire, given his limited technical background. "Someone with legitimate medical credentials was involved in this," insisted Dr. Gerald Faulkner, the county coroner who performed Harold's autopsy. The setup in that bunker reflected knowledge of psychiatric treatment modalities that went beyond what someone could learn from reading journals. And the chemicals we found, some weren't even available through standard hospital supply chains. The most disturbing aspect of the case emerged not from the bunker itself, but from the documentation recovered from Harold's study and the lockbox beneath the bunker floor. His notes revealed a chilling methodology that evolved over the 14 years of his work. The earliest entries, dating from 1954, described crude attempts at what he called behavioral modification using primarily physical restraint and basic sedatives. By 1960, his approach had become more refined, incorporating various pharmaceutical combinations and psychological techniques that he referred to as memory disruption protocols. Subject continues to resist direct commands but responds to implanted suggestions when administered under specific chemical conditions, he wrote in September 1960. The window of suggestibility lasts approximately 4 hours, after which reinforcement is necessary. Mapping of retention patterns continues. What became increasingly clear to investigators was that Harold Dykes wasn't simply experimenting with random psychological techniques. He was systematically developing methods to control human behavior through a combination of chemical and psychological manipulation. The question that remained unanswered was why. Some insight came from Richard Dykes, who, after initially cooperating with investigators, became increasingly reticent as the case unfolded. In one of his final interviews before moving permanently to Mobile, he revealed something about his father's military service that hadn't been previously documented. "Dad never talked much about the war," Richard explained, referring to Harold's service during World War II. "I knew he'd been in the Pacific, but not in combat. It wasn't until I found some papers after his death that I learned he'd been assigned to a medical unit that worked with shell-shocked soldiers. Something happened there, something that changed him. He came back different, according to my mother." Military records confirmed that Harold Dykes had indeed served in a specialized unit attached to the Naval Medical Corps from 1943 to 1946. Most of the records relating to this unit's activities remained classified even in the 1960s, but what could be ascertained was that the unit worked with combat veterans suffering from severe psychological trauma using what were described as emerging therapeutic techniques. This connection might have remained a footnote in the case had it not been for another development in 1970. A former hospital administrator named Robert Jenkins, who had worked at the county hospital during Harold's tenure, came forward with information that cast the case in an even more disturbing light. There was a research grant, Jenkins told investigators. It came through in 1954, a substantial sum allocated for advanced psychiatric treatment studies. The paperwork came from a foundation I'd never heard of, but the hospital board approved it without much discussion. Harold Dykes wasn't listed anywhere on the official documents, but he was suddenly given access to the psychiatric wing, despite his position in maintenance. At the time, I assumed he was just helping set up equipment. The foundation in question, the Berenson Institute for Medical Advancement, proved difficult to trace. It had been incorporated in Delaware in 1952 and dissolved in 1968, shortly after the Dykes investigation began. Its listed address in Washington, D.C., turned out to be a law office that handled paperwork for dozens of similar organizations. When pressed, Jenkins admitted that he had once overheard a conversation suggesting the funding ultimately came from a government source interested in behavioral research, though he couldn't provide specific details. This revelation prompted speculation about possible connections to rumored government programs focusing on mind control techniques, speculation that was neither confirmed nor refuted by official sources. What was certain was that someone had provided financial support for research conducted in a rural Alabama hospital, and that research appeared to have extended to unauthorized human experimentation in a private bunker. The audio recordings discovered in Harold's study provided the most direct evidence of what occurred in the bunker. Though often difficult to understand due to poor recording quality, they documented a methodical approach to breaking down and rebuilding human psychology. Subjects were referred to only by numbers, their voices growing increasingly compliant as the sessions progressed. "Tell me your name," Harold's voice would command on earlier recordings, met with resistance or confusion. "I am whoever you need me to be," the same subject would respond weeks later, their voice flat, emotionless. The female voice, presumed to be Mary Ann's, appeared primarily on recordings from 1960 onward, suggesting her involvement intensified in the later years of the operation. Her role seemed to focus on what Harold called cognitive restructuring, guiding subjects through scenarios designed to implant false memories or alter existing ones. "Describe your childhood home," she would instruct, and when the subject began to speak, she would interrupt with corrections. "No, that's not right. Your home had blue curtains, not white. The staircase was on the left side of the hallway. Your bedroom faced west, toward the mountains." Over multiple sessions, subjects would eventually adopt these false details, incorporating them into their own narratives. The purpose of this manipulation remained unclear from the recordings alone, but Harold's notes suggested it was part of a larger process of identity reconstruction. Complete dissociation from original self-concept achieved with Subject 7 after 26 sessions, he wrote in April 1965. Subject now fully accepts implanted background and responds to trigger phrases as conditioned, ready for field testing pending final approval. The phrase field testing appeared several times in the later journals, though no records indicated what this entailed or whether it ever occurred. The last dated entry in Harold's journals was from September 25, 1967, just 2 weeks before his death, and contained a troubling assessment: protocol perfected. Demonstration scheduled for November. Results will secure extended funding. This entry suggested that Harold had been planning to showcase his work to someone, presumably representatives of whoever had been supporting his research. His unexpected death interrupted whatever demonstration had been planned, and possibly saved his final subject from the fate of the others. As for Marianne Dykes, her disappearance into obscurity following her hospitalization in 1968 left many questions unanswered. The extent of her knowledge and participation remained a matter of speculation, though the recorded evidence strongly suggested active involvement. Some investigators believed she had been a willing partner in Harold's activities from the beginning, while others theorized that she might have initially been a victim of his techniques, who was gradually transformed into a collaborator. "The female voice on those recordings changes over time," noted one state investigator in his final report. "In the earlier tapes, there's hesitation, even reluctance. By 1965, the same voice speaks with authority, confidence. It's as if we're hearing someone who has fully embraced a role they once questioned." The bunker itself, before being filled with concrete and sealed in 1970, revealed additional details during the final, most thorough examination conducted by state authorities. The secondary chamber, initially described as a simple room with medical equipment, was found to have walls lined with a specialized acoustic material that absorbed sound. Most disturbing was the discovery of a false wall that, when removed, revealed a space barely large enough for a human to stand. A space where, investigators theorized, subjects might have been isolated as part of their conditioning. The drainage system, when fully excavated, was found to connect not only to the separate septic tank, but also to a series of filters that would have prevented certain chemical compounds from entering the surrounding soil, suggesting an awareness that what was being disposed of could be detected or might cause environmental damage. The floor featured embedded restraint points arranged in a precise pattern. Perhaps the most unsettling physical evidence came from the walls themselves. When investigators applied specialized lighting to the seemingly blank concrete surfaces, they discovered markings, tallies, scratches, and in one corner what appeared to be a name that had been mostly obscured by later applications of sealant. These markings, concealed beneath layers of paint, suggested that Harold's subjects had attempted to leave some record of their existence, some proof that they had been there, before their identities were systematically erased. The full impact of the Dykes case on Milford City would take years to manifest. Initially, many residents refused to believe the allegations, defending Harold as a respected member of the community and dismissing the investigation as overblown. As more details emerged, however, the town's collective denial gave way to a profound discomfort. Attendance at the local hospital declined sharply, with many residents traveling to facilities in neighboring counties rather than seek treatment where those things had happened. The psychiatric wing of the county hospital was closed in 1971, officially due to budget constraints but widely understood to be a response to the scandal. The hospital itself struggled for years afterward, finally merging with a regional healthcare system in 1977 and undergoing a complete administrative restructuring. For the families of those who had disappeared from the hospital during Harold's tenure, the investigation offered little closure. Most of the missing patients had been effectively erased from official records through forged transfers, and no definitive evidence of their ultimate fate was ever discovered. No human remains were found on the Dykes property, despite extensive searching, leading to theories that ranged from disposal in remote locations to the possibility that some subjects had been released after being reprogrammed, perhaps living under new identities, unaware of their true pasts. Dorothy Winters, the administrative assistant whose testimony had been crucial to connecting Harold to the missing patients, remained convinced that the full truth extended beyond what the investigation had uncovered. It wasn't just 7 people, she insisted in a statement given to investigators in 1970. Those were just the ones I could specifically remember, the ones where the paperwork stood out as irregular. But there were others, patients, who were admitted for minor issues, then suddenly diagnosed with more serious conditions that required specialized treatment. Patients who were sedated for transport and never seen again. How many were there in total? How far back did it go? And who else knew? These questions remained largely unanswered. Hospital records prior to 1952 had been destroyed in a fire, conveniently eliminating any evidence of earlier disappearances. Most of the doctors who had authorized the suspicious transfers had relocated or retired by the time the investigation began, and those who could be located claimed to have signed the paperwork in good faith, believing the patients were being moved to better-equipped facilities. The case eventually faded from public attention, overshadowed by national events and the passing of time. But in Milford City, its legacy persisted in subtle ways, in the reluctance of residents to discuss certain topics, in the vacant lot where the Dykes house once stood before being demolished in 1975, in the unspoken rule that certain areas of the property were to be avoided. For those directly involved in the investigation, the impact was more profound. Officer James Merritt, who had accompanied Deputy Holloway on the initial response to Mary Ann's call, requested a transfer to traffic duty shortly afterward and retired from law enforcement entirely in 1972. Sheriff William Tanner, who had led the investigation, lost his bid for re-election in 1968, with many attributing his defeat to public discomfort with the case. Dr. Gerald Faulkner continued as county coroner, but was known to refuse certain cases that bore any similarity to the Dykes matter, delegating them to colleagues. The most tangible legacy of the case was perhaps the collection of documents, recordings, and photographs assembled during the investigation, materials that were sealed by court order in 1970 and placed in the state archives with instructions that they remain unopened for 50 years. This decision, controversial at the time, was justified as necessary to protect the privacy of the victims' families and prevent the dissemination of the behavioral modification techniques documented in Harold's notes. These are not methods that should be replicated, stated the judge who issued the sealing order, nor are they experiences that should be sensationalized. What occurred in that bunker represents a profound violation of human dignity and medical ethics. The details should be preserved for historical and educational purposes, but not before sufficient time has passed to ensure they will be viewed with appropriate soberness and ethical clarity. In 1973, a geology student from Auburn University visited Milford City as part of a research project on groundwater systems in rural Alabama. While collecting soil samples approximately half a mile from the former Dykes property, he discovered something unusual, a metal canister buried approximately 2 feet below the surface. Inside were several glass vials containing what appeared to be biological specimens, along with a notebook protected in a waterproof case. The student, whose name was redacted from later reports, turned these materials over to his professor, who in turn contacted state authorities after recognizing potential connections to the Dykes case. The notebook, written in what was confirmed to be Harold Dykes's handwriting, contained observations dated between 1964 and 1966, a period for which many of his other records were incomplete. Unlike the clinical tone of his bunker journals, these field notes were more personal, even introspective. They documented what Harold called post-treatment monitoring, suggesting that at least some of his subjects had indeed been released back into society after their programming was complete. Subject 4 continues to function within parameters, he wrote in August 1965. Employed as a janitor at elementary school and redacted, no recollection of previous identity. Trigger phrase tested during casual encounter. Response immediate and precise. Subject carried out assigned task without hesitation or subsequent memory of action. These notes provided the first concrete evidence of what happened to at least some of Harold's subjects. They had been released with implanted identities and programmed responses to specific triggers, essentially becoming dormant agents who could be activated to perform tasks without their conscious awareness. The implications were profoundly disturbing, suggesting that the purpose of Harold's experiments extended beyond mere research into practical application. The biological specimens in the vials were determined to be tissue samples, preserved in a solution that had partially degraded over time. Limited testing revealed them to be human in origin, though more specific identification was impossible with the technology available in the 1970s. The purpose of collecting and preserving these samples remained unclear, though Harold's notes made occasional references to physiological adaptations and cellular response patterns. This discovery prompted a brief reopening of the investigation in 1973, but with Harold deceased, Marianne disappeared, and most leads long cold, little new information emerged. The materials found by the geology student were added to the sealed archives, with an addendum noting their significance as evidence of a broader scope to the Dykes operation than previously confirmed. Perhaps the most significant development in understanding the case came not from official investigations, but from the personal research of a journalist named Michael Brennan. In 1976, while working on a broader story about rural health care in Alabama, Brennan became interested in the rumors surrounding the closed psychiatric wing of the county hospital. His initial inquiries met with resistance, but his persistence eventually led him to several former hospital employees willing to share their recollections off the record. What emerged from these conversations was a picture of systematic negligence that had enabled Harold's activities. Budget constraints had led to minimal staffing on nights and weekends, precisely when most of the suspicious transfers occurred. Oversight of medication inventories was lax, with discrepancies often attributed to clerical errors rather than investigated. Most tellingly, several employees recalled Harold's unusual interest in certain patients, particularly those without family connections who were receiving treatment for conditions that left them vulnerable to manipulation. He would bring them things: cigarettes, candy, magazines, one former nurse told Brennan. He'd spend time talking with them when most other staff barely acknowledged them. At the time, I thought he was just being kind to people who had been forgotten by everyone else. Now I wonder if he was evaluating them, selecting the ones who would suit his purposes. Brennan's investigation also revealed a pattern of institutional silence that persisted long after the case was officially closed. Former hospital administrators acknowledged awareness of irregularities, but cited limited resources and bureaucratic constraints as reasons for their inaction. Several admitted to doubts about certain patient transfers, but noted that questioning doctors' orders was not part of their role. The system was designed to prevent accountability, Brennan concluded in notes for an article that was never published due to legal concerns. Each person saw only their piece of the puzzle, and those who might have connected the dots were incentivized to look away. Whether through deliberate collusion or structural negligence, an environment was created where someone like Harold Dykes could operate with minimal risk of detection. The question of whether Harold had acted alone or as part of a larger operation remained unresolved. The financial connection to the mysterious Berenson Institute suggested outside involvement, as did the sophistication of some of the equipment and compounds found in the bunker. Yet no definitive link to any governmental or private research program was ever established, despite periodic rumors and theories. One such theory emerged in 1979 when a former military intelligence officer claimed in an anonymous letter to the state attorney general's office that Harold's work had been part of a classified program investigating psychological warfare applications. The letter contained specific details about the bunker's design that had not been made public, lending credibility to the writer's claims. However, no official acknowledgement or investigation followed, and the letter was eventually filed away with other unverified information related to the case. For the residents of Milford City, the Dykes case gradually transformed from a shocking local scandal to a kind of cautionary tale, a story told to remind people that evil can exist behind the most ordinary facades. The property where the Dykes house once stood remained vacant for decades, despite its prime location and the growth of the surrounding area. Local real estate agents were known to avoid showing it to potential buyers, offering vague explanations about soil issues or zoning complications. The bunker itself, filled with concrete and buried beneath additional soil, became physically inaccessible, but remained psychologically present in the community's consciousness. Children were warned not to play in that area, though few understood why. Occasionally, someone would suggest developing the land, only to face unexpected resistance from longtime residents who preferred that it remain untouched. In 1978, Richard Dykes made a final appearance in Milford City, arriving unannounced on a Tuesday morning in early March. Now in his early 40s and described by those who saw him as haggard and nervous, he visited the county clerk's office to formally relinquish any claim to his family's property. When asked by a clerk where he had been living, he reportedly gave 3 different answers in the span of a brief conversation, each time seeming momentarily confused by his own response. Richard was seen later that day standing at the edge of the former family property, staring at the overgrown area where the bunker had been. A local teenager who observed him from a distance reported that he remained there, motionless, for nearly an hour before abruptly walking away. He checked into the local motel that evening, but was gone by morning, leaving behind a Bible in which certain passages related to forgiveness had been heavily underlined. No confirmed sightings of Richard Dykes were reported after this visit, and his subsequent whereabouts remained unknown. The most enduring mystery of the Dykes case, the fate of Mary Ann, generated periodic rumors but little concrete information. In 1971, a woman matching her description was reportedly working as a nurse's aide at a small private clinic in Nebraska under the name Mary Davis, but she disappeared before investigators could verify her identity. In 1976, a retirement community in Arizona reported a new resident whose paperwork contained discrepancies similar to those used in the false transfer documents from the county hospital. But this lead also proved inconclusive. The strongest evidence of Mary Ann's continued existence came in 1979 when a handwritten letter arrived at the office of the state attorney general. The envelope bore no return address, and forensic examination revealed no usable fingerprints, but handwriting analysis suggested the author was indeed Mary Ann Dykes. The contents were brief and cryptic. What was done cannot be undone. The subjects are still out there, living the lives we gave them. Some have built families, careers, communities, all based on identities that were manufactured in that bunker. To expose them now would destroy not just them, but everyone connected to them. The kindest thing, the only moral thing, is to let them remain in the merciful darkness of ignorance. I have carried this burden for 12 years. When I am gone, it will die with me. This is my final communication on this matter. No further letters were received, and no definitive trace of Mary Ann Dykes was ever found. Whether she lived out her remaining years in anonymity or met some other fate remains unknown. Some investigators speculated that she might have become a subject of the same type of manipulation she had helped inflict, her own identity erased and replaced. Others believed she had simply found a way to disappear completely, carrying her secrets to the grave. As for the subjects mentioned in her letter, those who had allegedly been released with programmed identities, no systematic attempt was ever made to identify or locate them. The ethical and practical complications were considered insurmountable. How could such individuals be found without specific identifying information? And if found, what should be done? Would revealing the truth about their pasts be an act of liberation or cruelty? These questions remained theoretical until 1980, when a man was arrested in a small town approximately 70 miles from Milford City after suffering what witnesses described as a breakdown in a local diner. The man, who had been living in the community for nearly 15 years under the name Edward Wilson, began screaming and clutching his head after another patron used a phrase that investigators later determined matched one of the trigger sequences documented in Harold's notes. Wilson was hospitalized for psychiatric evaluation, during which he experienced periods of lucidity alternating with profound confusion about his identity. During one session, he claimed to have been a patient at the county hospital in 1962, admitted for what he called temporary exhaustion following the loss of his job. His next clear memory was waking up in a different city 2 years later with a complete set of identification documents and a job as a maintenance worker, but no recollection of how he had gotten there. Medical examination revealed unusual scarring on Wilson's temples and forearms, consistent with long-term restraint and possible electroshock therapy. Blood tests showed traces of compounds that matched substances found in the Dykes bunker, suggesting long-term exposure. Most significantly, when shown photographs of Harold and Mary Ann Dykes, Wilson exhibited a physiological stress response so severe that the interview had to be terminated. The Wilson case provided the first concrete evidence that Mary Ann's letter had been truthful, that some unknown number of Harold's subjects had indeed been released into society with programmed identities and responses. It also raised disturbing questions about how many others might be living similar lives of unknowing fabrication. Due to Wilson's fragile psychological state and concerns about further trauma, investigators did not pursue extensive questioning about his experiences. He was provided with specialized psychiatric care and eventually relocated with a new identity, his privacy protected by court order. His case file was added to the sealed archives, with a notation that any further individuals displaying similar patterns should be handled with extreme caution and compassion. The sealed archives containing the complete documentation of the Dykes case were scheduled to be opened in 2020, 50 years after the original sealing order. However, in 1995, this date was extended by judicial review for an additional 25 years, with the justification that many of the individuals potentially affected might still be living, and that the techniques documented in Harold's notes remained dangerous if disseminated. For the residents of Milford City, the passage of time gradually transformed the Dykes case from recent history to local legend. Newer residents heard distorted versions of the story, with details exaggerated or altered with each retelling. The property where the bunker had been located was eventually developed in the late 1980s, with a small office building constructed on the site, its foundation deliberately designed to avoid the area where the concrete-filled bunker remained buried. The county hospital, after changing ownership several times, was finally demolished in 1997 to make way for a modern medical center. During the demolition, workers discovered a sealed metal box hidden within a wall of the former psychiatric wing. Inside were patient files that had been presumed lost or destroyed, files that included intake information for 3 of the patients who had disappeared during Harold's tenure. These documents provided the first photographs of some of his victims, giving faces to those who had been reduced to numbers in his journals. The files were added to the sealed archives, completing a record that remains one of the most disturbing chapters in the region's history. What happened in that backyard bunker between 1954 and 1967 represents a perfect storm of institutional failure, individual pathology, and the dangerous potential of unchecked psychological research. The full extent of Harold Dykes' activities and their lasting impact on an unknown number of lives may never be fully documented or understood. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the case is not what was discovered, but what remains unknown. How many of Harold's subjects are still out there, living lives built on manufactured identities? How many might have passed those fabricated histories to children and grandchildren, creating entire family narratives founded on deliberate falsehoods? And what other triggers might still be embedded in aging minds, waiting for the precise combination of words or circumstances to activate programming implanted decades ago? The concrete bunker behind the Dykes family home has been physically buried, its entrance sealed, and its chambers filled. But the legacy of what occurred there remains, not just in sealed archives or local memory, but potentially in the fractured psyches of unknown victims still walking among us, carrying within them the terrible secrets of Milford City.